Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling stories of the Appalachian Mountains, in the Kentucky Highlands, where mist dances among the pines and silence holds ancient secrets. There is a story that doesn't make sense. Please tell us where you are watching from as we get into this dark story that will always be remembered in those forgotten mountains. This video is a work of fiction made only for fun. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, is completely coincidental. There have always been contradictions in Kentucky. Its mountains are wild and beautiful, and they are very isolated. Whole communities are cut off from the rest of the world by miles of thick forest and dangerous paths. At the start of the 20th century, these areas were almost outside of time. News took weeks to get there, and the law didn't have much power over the remote valleys. It was a place where stories began and ended without anyone seeing them, and nature ruled over any attempt by people to control it. People in the area knew Abigail Kincaid as a woman with a strong personality and strange habits. She lived alone in an old wooden house that had been passed down through her family. It was on the edge of civilization and the unknown. Her closest neighbors lived more than 3 kilometers away, and not many people came to her door without a good reason. There was something about the way she looked at people that made even the bravest feel uneasy. The Kincaid estate had a history. Settlers built it decades ago in the hopes of finding their fortune in the mountains. The land had never been good to its owners. Crops failed for no clear reason, animals got sick for no clear reason, and the air felt heavier there, as if it were denser. Some people thought these things were happening because the soil wasn't good. Others told less logical stories that were quietly told in the region's taverns. Abigail didn't have many friends. She only went to the city when she really had to, and she always went in the late afternoon when the streets were starting to empty. She bought what she needed, talked to the shopkeepers for a few minutes, and then went back to her mountain before it got completely dark. No one knew for sure how she spent her days on that remote property, but there were a lot of rumors going around to fill the gap. Something happened in 1920. People driving by the road near the property started to notice strange things happening. Lights moving through the trees at night, sounds that didn't sound like they came from any known animal, and a heavy feeling that made the horses refuse to go any further. At first, people thought these reports were just normal superstitions of people who traveled through remote areas, but the number of sightings began to draw attention. The owner of the grocery store in town said that Abigail had changed the way she shopped. In the past, she only bought the basics for one person, but lately she has been buying more food. When asked a question in a subtle way, she would change the subject or leave without finishing the conversation. Her behavior, which was always reserved, had become even more mysterious. A local hunter with a lot of experience chose to look into it on his own. He knew those mountains better than most people and didn't believe in curses or ghost stories. One fall afternoon, when the ground was covered in golden leaves that looked like a welcoming carpet, he walked up to the Kincaid property. He didn't get to the house, but he could see it from a distance, hidden among the oak trees. What he saw really upset him, but he could never explain it clearly. He only said that there was something very wrong with that place, something that he couldn't explain with all of his years of experience in the mountains. More reports came in the weeks that followed. A mailman who delivered mail to farms nearby said he saw shadows at the Kincaid's window and more than one person moving inside. This would be normal in any other house, but everyone knew Abigail lived alone. When asked about possible visitors in a quiet way, she strongly denied it, her eyes shining with a mix of anger and something harder to pin down, maybe fear. The air in the mountains became heavier and heavier. Even people who didn't believe in superstitions started to stay away from the road that went by the Kincaid property and took longer routes instead. The silence that was always there in that area now seemed to weigh heavily on the shoulders of anyone who came near. The trees, rocks, and even the ground beneath their feet seemed to be watching something that no one should see. In that part of Kentucky, the morning fog in the Appalachians always had its own personality. It fell from the heights like a living cloak, covering paths and turning familiar trees into strange shapes. But it acted differently around the Kincaid property. It seemed thicker there, more persistent, and stayed even after the sun had already cleared the mist in other valleys. Over the years, people who lived in the mountains developed strange instincts. They learned to read signs in nature that visitors miss, and to hear the wind whisper warnings among the pine trees. All of these instincts told them the same thing: stay away from that old wooden house on the hilltop. It wasn't just small-town gossip or curiosity. It was something deeper, a primal warning that came from somewhere deep inside their minds. Abigail started showing up in town at even stranger times. She would sometimes show up at dawn when the stores were just starting to open. Sometimes, late at night, she would knock on the doors of shopkeepers and demand to be served. Her face, which was always pale from being alone in the mountains, now looked see-through in the lantern's dim light. There were deep shadows in her eyes, as if sleep had left her completely. One night in 1921, she went to the local pharmacy and asked for a lot of certain herbs. Some of them were for medicine, and some of them were for less clear purposes. The pharmacist, a middle-aged man who knew almost everyone in the area, tried to start a conversation. He asked if everything was okay on the property and if she needed help. Abigail looked at him with an unsettling intensity and said one thing that would be talked about for weeks. There are debts that need to be paid, and payment doesn't accept delays. No one could figure out what those words meant. What kind of debt might this be? With whom? The Kincaid family had never had any known money problems, and Abigail didn't have any close friends who would make her responsible for things like that. There was a lot of speculation, and each theory was more complex than the last. Some people thought she had made a deal with shady travelers who sometimes crossed those mountains. Some people talked about cursed inheritances, or promises made by ancestors that were now coming due. The property started to smell strange. It wasn't strong enough to be smelled from a distance, but people who got close said it smelled sweet and sickening, like fruit that had been left out in the sun for too long, mixed with something else that couldn't be identified. The trees around the house looked sick. Their leaves were falling off out of season and their branches were breaking under their own weight even when there were no storms. There were dark patches on the ground that got bigger over time. A preacher who was traveling through the area decided to stop by and see Abigail. He thought it was his spiritual duty to reach out to even the most isolated members of the community and offer them comfort and advice. He climbed the steep path to the property on a foggy afternoon, holding his Bible tightly under his arm. He knocked on the old wooden door and waited. The preacher couldn't help but pull back when Abigail finally opened it. There was something in her face that made him speechless for a long time. It was a mix of despair and determination. She didn't let him in. The doorframe was the only thing that kept them apart. The preacher tried to pray and talk about peace and redemption, but Abigail cut him off. She said that choices were made long before she was born, paths were set by blood and soil, and that certain chains couldn't be broken by nice words or good intentions. She thanked him for coming with a cold, mechanical politeness, then gently closed the door, leaving the man alone on the creaking porch below. He got down the mountain faster than he had climbed it. He told anyone who would listen that that woman and that place were very strange and scary. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt like he was around something strange, something that went against the basic rules of how the world should work. His words, coming from a well-known man of faith in the area, made the worries even worse. The nights in the mountains got even scarier. In the valleys, sounds traveled in strange ways, with echoes that sounded like they were coming from impossible places. Some people said they heard voices speaking in languages they didn't know, and the words made their skin crawl, even though they didn't know what they meant. Others talked about songs played on instruments that no one knew, music that didn't follow normal patterns, and made people feel sick when they heard it. Abigail cut herself off even more. She stopped going to town altogether, and the shopkeepers who had complained about her strange visits were now worried about how she was living. No one brought her anything. No one offered to help, and the crops around her house had all died. Winter was coming, and those mountains were very hard to deal with in the winter. How did she plan to make it through the season without enough food? The cold weather came to the Kentucky mountains like it always does. The snow covered the winding paths, turning the area into a white wasteland where you could see movement for miles. At this time of year, people in the Appalachian Mountains would shut themselves off from the outside world and rely on their own resources to get through the winter. The cold coming down from the heights made these lands even more isolated than they already were. The Kincaid property was strangely busy during those cold months. There was always smoke coming from the chimney, which meant that someone kept the fire going all day and night. This wouldn't be strange on its own, but no one had seen Abigail gather firewood in the weeks leading up to this. Where did the fuel come from to keep those flames going? The smoke also had a strange color. It was a greenish-gray color that mixed with the gray and spread an odor that reached the lower valleys when the wind blew in the right direction. A fur trader who traveled through the mountains to trade with hunters chose to take a chance and visit the property. He had things that might interest someone who lived alone, and he was just as interested in Abigail's health as he was in making money. He walked along the snowy path, and with each step, his feet sank to his ankles. As he got closer to the house, the air seemed to get thicker, as if the atmosphere itself didn't want him to be there. He knocked on the door a few times, but no one answered. He called Abigail's name, but the snow that was still falling made it hard to hear. He was about to give up when he heard movement inside the house. Someone was slowly dragging their feet toward the door. There was only a small opening in the door. He didn't remember ever seeing chains before, but he could see part of the inside through the small opening. He instinctively pulled away from what he saw. The house was a complete mess. The furniture was pushed against the walls, and the floor was covered in strange marks that looked like they had been drawn with charcoal or something darker. There were candles lit all over the place, and their weak, flickering light made shadows that danced on the walls. There were things hanging from the ceiling that he couldn't quite make out at first, but they made his stomach hurt. Abigail's face was so pale that it almost blended in with the snow outside when she came through the crack. She told him to go and never come back because she didn't need anything. There was a sense of urgency in her voice, almost like she was warning me. Without a doubt, he did what he was told. He hurried down the mountain awkwardly, stumbling in the snow and looking back every few steps as if he thought someone was following him. When he finally got to the area where people lived, he told everyone who would listen about what had happened. His words added to the rumors that were already going around. What was going on in that house that was so far away? What kinds of things was Abigail doing by herself, away from other people? Tales about the Kincaid estate started to sound like they were from a story. People who had never been to the place swore they knew certain things that were passed around by word of mouth and changed with each telling. They talked about ceremonies that took place on the full moon, visitors who came in the middle of the night and left before dawn, and noises that made the wolves howl together in the mountains nearby. It was impossible to tell how much of these stories were true and how much was made up by a group of people. A strange event in 1922 made Abigail even more famous. She went to the local church while she was in town for a short time. The people were already there for the service on Sunday morning. When she walked in, everyone stopped listening to the sermon and looked at the thin, pale figure in the doorway. There was complete silence, except for the sound of the candles on the altar crackling. Abigail walked slowly down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the wooden space. She reached the front, stared intently at the preacher, and then simply turned and left without uttering a single word. No one knew how to interpret that gesture. Was it a silent plea for help? A provocation? A final farewell before something irreversible? The preacher, the same one who had visited her property months before, was visibly shaken. He tried to continue the sermon, but his words came out disjointed, his concentration completely broken. After the service ended, he gathered some of the most respected members of the community and suggested that perhaps it was time for someone to intervene, to check if Abigail was in danger or posed any kind of threat. People were hesitant to accept the suggestion. Intervening in the life of someone so isolated, especially without clear evidence of anything illegal, went against the customs of that region. People in the Appalachians valued privacy and autonomy above almost everything else. But the growing unease overcame these traditions. They decided that a small group would visit the property, just to check if everything was all right and offer assistance if needed. No one volunteered enthusiastically, but eventually 3 men agreed to make the journey. They chose a clear afternoon for the expedition, when the snow had temporarily stopped and the paths were minimally passable. They climbed the mountain together, finding strength in their numbers, their breaths creating clouds of vapor in the icy air. The closer they got to the property, the slower their progress became. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion of the climb, but something more subtle, an invisible resistance that made each step harder than the last. They finally reached the wooden gate that marked the beginning of the Kincaid property. It was open, swaying slightly in the breeze, its rusty hinges groaning a sharp, unsettling sound. The house stood ahead, its structure seeming smaller and more curved than they remembered, as if slowly being swallowed by the earth. The windows were dark, despite it being mid-afternoon, and the smoke that had once risen steadily from the chimney was now absent. The silence around was absolute. No birds sang, no animals stirred among the trees. The 3 men stood before the gate for a considerable time, each waiting for the other to take the initiative to move forward. The courage they had mustered in the village seemed to have evaporated during the climb, replaced by an apprehension that grew with each passing second. The air around the property had a strange quality, colder than it should have been even considering the altitude, and laden with a dampness that penetrated through their heavy winter clothing. Finally, the oldest of the group took the first step beyond the gate. His companions followed, keeping close to one another, as if physical distance could somehow protect them from the growing unease. The path to the house was covered in untouched snow, without recent footprints, suggesting that Abigail had not left or received visitors for days. The surrounding trees seemed to watch them, their bare branches outstretched like twisted fingers against the gray sky. As they approached the veranda, they noticed details that weren't visible from a distance. Symbols had been carved into the wood of the door and windows, circular marks and crisscrossing lines that didn't follow any recognizable pattern. They were crude, seemingly made with improvised tools, but there was something deliberate about their arrangement. They completely surrounded every opening in the house, as if intended to keep something inside or prevent something from entering. The older man knocked firmly on the door. 3 knocks that echoed louder than they should have in the suffocating silence. They waited. No answer came from inside. He knocked again, this time calling Abigail's name, identifying himself and explaining that they had come only to check on her. The silence persisted, so complete that they could hear their own heartbeats pounding in their ears. One of the men suggested that perhaps she was sleeping or too ill to answer. They tried the doorknob. It was unlocked, turning easily under the pressure of their hand. The door opened slowly, its hinges protesting with a long, sharp creak. The interior of the house was bathed in twilight, the windows covered with heavy cloths that blocked almost all outside light. A strong smell emanated from within, that same sweet, cloying fragrance that had been reported before, now intensified by the confinement. The three men stood at the door, unsure if they wanted to go in. The main room of the house was a scene of calculated disorder. Furniture had been arranged in specific patterns, creating narrow paths between them. The floor was covered with more of those symbols, drawn with something that permanently stained the wood. Melted candles formed mountains of wax on every available surface, their wicks extinguished long ago for the wax to cool completely. And hanging from the ceiling, swaying slightly in the draft from the open door, were objects wrapped in dark fabric, packages tied with strings that dripped something viscous. They called Abigail again, but their voices sounded strange and muffled in that small space. They carefully walked around the room, making sure not to step on the marks on the floor, even though they didn't know why they felt that way. The house only had a few rooms, so it didn't take them long to look through them all. They found evidence that someone had been there recently, half-empty glasses, scattered blankets, but no sign of Abigail. The most disturbing part was the back room of the house. The walls were completely covered with writing, words scribbled in irregular letters that rose from the floor to the ceiling. Some were legible, fragmented phrases about debts and promises, names none of them recognized, dates that went back decades before Abigail's birth. Others were completely incomprehensible, combinations of letters that didn't form words in any known language. There was a perfect circle in the middle of the room, and inside it were things that Abigail probably owned. The men left the house faster than they had come in, breathing in the cold mountain air like they were underwater. None of them spoke right away because they were all thinking about what they had seen. In the end, they all agreed that they needed to tell someone what they had found, but they had a hard time putting into words the strange feeling they had when they walked into that house, as if they had entered a place where things that were beyond human understanding had happened. They went down the mountain in quiet thought. The people of the town asked them a lot of worried questions, but their answers were vague and not very helpful. How could they explain what couldn't be explained? What words could they use to describe the heavy feeling on their chests as they stood there? They just said that Abigail wasn't home, that the inside looked like it had been disturbed in a very bad way, and that it might be best to leave the property alone. But Abigail's absence brought up new questions. Where could she have gone if she wasn't home and there were no footprints in the snow? Anyone who went into the mountains in the winter without being ready would die. There was no way to get from that property to any place where people lived without going through places where she would be seen. It was as if she had just disappeared, leaving behind only that creepy scene and the questions that came with it. Some people said that a bigger search should be organized, looking in the areas around the property and in caves and other natural shelters where she might have gone to hide. Some people said that Abigail would have made it easier for people to find her if she wanted to be found. It looked like she chose not to be there on purpose, knowing full well what would happen. Some people in the community wanted to take action, while others preached respect for privacy and personal freedom. While they were arguing, more snow fell on the Kentucky mountains, covering the Kincaid property with another layer of clean white. The house stayed there, dark and quiet, keeping its secret safe behind walls covered in strange symbols. The trees around them kept watch, silently witnessing events that made no sense. Abigail Kincaid had become part of the mystery that had always surrounded those ancient lands, somewhere in those huge, harsh mountains. In the weeks that followed, that part of the Appalachians became eerily quiet. The Kincaid property was still empty, and its presence in the landscape was like a wound that wouldn't heal. No one wanted to go near those lands again, and even the best hunters changed their routes to avoid them. It was clear that some places have energies that go beyond logic, and this was one of them. Spring came, as it always does in the mountains, and the snow melted, revealing the earth below that had been sleeping. With the thaw, travelers were able to cross those passes again. Merchants were able to go back to their usual routes, and life in the remote communities got back to its seasonal rhythm. But the story of Abigail Kincaid and her strange property had spread beyond the borders of the villages, thanks to people who traveled between them. A scholar of regional traditions who was interested in mountain stories decided to look into it herself. He was from a bigger city in eastern Kentucky and was interested in how small, isolated communities came up with their own myths. He thought Abigail's story was a great example of how ordinary facts could become legends through repetition and embellishment. He came to the area in 1923 with the goal of figuring out what was real and what was made up. His careful and doubtful way of doing things was met with immediate resistance. People who lived there didn't like it when outsiders questioned their experiences, especially when those questions were asked in a condescending way. But some people agreed to talk, maybe because they thought that an outside observer could help them see things in a new way. The conversation showed the scholar that the topic was more complicated than they had thought. Everyone who had talked to Abigail told a slightly different story about what happened, but they all agreed on the main points. She had changed a lot in the last few months, going from being a loner to being very troubled. Her actions made it seem like she was under a lot of stress and was responding to demands that only she could see. Everyone agreed that the house had an atmosphere that couldn't be explained in a normal way. The scholar chose to go to the property by himself, sure that his common sense would keep him safe from local superstitions. He climbed the mountain on a clear spring morning with a notebook in hand, ready to write down what he saw. There was new growth on the trail, showing that nature was already taking back the paths that people had tamed for a short time. Birds sang in the trees, which was very different from what he had heard about complete silence. When he got to the property, his confidence started to fade right away. Even during the day, when his mind was trained to look for logical explanations, that place felt oppressive in a way that couldn't be explained. He had to work harder to breathe because the air felt heavier. The house looked just like other visitors had said it would. The door was open, there were symbols on the picture frames, and it had that feeling of having been abandoned recently that makes a place seem more haunted than old ruins. He walked in carefully, his initial bravado giving way to a reluctant respect for how uncomfortable he was. Animals had gotten in through broken windows and messed up some of the inside, but the symbols on the floor, the writing on the walls, and the things hanging from the ceiling were all still there, waiting. He started to write down notes, describing each detail with academic accuracy, but his hands shook a little, showing that he wasn't really being objective. She spent hours looking at the words on the walls, trying to figure out what they meant or what they meant. Some phrases were clear in their sadness. They were sad about choices that couldn't be made and consequences that had to happen. Some of them looked like instructions for rituals, but it wasn't clear what they were for. And there were a lot of names, some of which were clearly from the Kincaid family from long ago, and others that were completely unknown. It was as if Abigail were trying to make a family tree of debts that went back decades. The scholar suddenly realized that he had completely lost track of time when the sun began to set on the horizon. He had planned to spend only a few hours on the property, but he got so caught up in his observations that the whole day went by. As the light faded, the inside of the house changed. Shadows grew longer and twisted the symbols on the floor, making them look like they were moving when he looked at them out of the corner of his eye. He left quickly, and his rush wasn't just because he needed to get down the mountain before it got too dark. There was something else, a deep urge that went against all of his logical training and told him to get out of there. He looked back one last time before heading back. The house seemed to be watching him, and the dark windows looked like empty eyes. And for the first time in his academic career, he thought that maybe some stories weren't just lies or superstitions, but rather poor attempts to describe things that went beyond what most people could understand. When he got back to the village, the way he talked to the people there was different. There was no longer any condescension in his questions, and there was no longer any poorly hidden doubt. He had felt what they were trying to say. That strange presence that made the Kincaid property stand out from other abandoned places. He could explain it logically by saying that the combination of being alone, Abigail's strange behavior, and cultural expectations caused a group psychological reaction. But deep down, in parts of himself that he rarely accessed, he wasn't sure about that explanation. A few days later, he left the area with notebooks full of notes and a restlessness that would stay with him for years. He never wrote an academic article based on his research, as he had planned to do. When coworkers asked him about his research in the Kentucky mountains, he would change the subject and make vague excuses about not having enough data or not finding the story interesting enough. The truth was both simpler and more complicated. He didn't know how to put that experience into words that his friends would understand without thinking he was crazy. The property stayed quiet, a reminder of mysteries that had not yet been solved. The structure fell apart over time, with each season leaving its mark. The wood slowly rotted, the roof began to sag in places, and the last bits of glass fell out of the windows. But the symbols stayed visible, as if they were fighting the weather in a way that seemed to go against the natural laws of decay. And the stories about Abigail Kincaid kept going around, getting more and more details with each telling, becoming something bigger than the facts ever were. The years that followed changed Abigail Kincaid's story into something that went beyond what any one person could remember. People told stories about it around campfires on cold nights, and whispered about it to each other as they traveled the lonely Appalachian trails. Every generation came up with its own ideas and theories about what really happened on that lonely hilltop property. The house was still standing, even though people thought it would fall down soon. It should have fallen apart a long time ago. The rotting beams should have given way under the weight of the winter snow, and the walls should have crumbled in the strong winds that hit those heights. But it stayed, leaning and falling apart. Yes, but in ways that engineers couldn't easily explain, it stayed structurally sound. It was as if something other than basic carpentry held it up, a stubbornness that was like the last person who lived there. A farming family thought about buying the Kincaid lands in 1925. The property was technically up for sale, but it had been empty for long enough for legal ownership issues to come up. Even though the soil had a bad reputation, it was fairly fertile, and the area had access to natural water sources. It made sense from a practical point of view, but when they went there with a local representative who helped them buy land, the decision was quick and final. No amount of money would make them move there. The representative, a practical man, who had helped with dozens of similar deals over the years, was really upset by the visit. He later said that when they got close to the property, the horses wouldn't move, planting their hooves on the ground and neighing in a strange way. They had to tie them up far away and walk the rest of the way. At first, the family didn't believe the stories that were going around, but when they saw the house, they changed their minds. The kids started crying for no reason, and the head of the family said without a doubt that she would not go into that building under any circumstances. When they tried to do something else with the property later, they faced the same problems. No one was interested, even if the price dropped a lot. People who were rational didn't want to use the word cursed in serious conversation, but it perfectly summed up how everyone felt. The house stayed the same, an unintentional monument to things that no one really understood. Every now and then, curious people would still make the trip there because of the stories that kept spreading. A few people came looking for cheap thrills, hoping to be scared so they could tell scary stories later. Some people were more serious about their interests and wanted to learn about things that didn't fit with what was already known. But everyone who left felt something, and it was a feeling that words couldn't fully express. A traveling artist who painted landscapes in the mountains chose the Kincaid house as his subject. He camped nearby for a few days and watched how the light changed on the building at different times and how the shadows acted strangely even when the sun was high. His first sketches were very accurate in showing the details of the building, but the longer he looked at the house, the more distorted his drawings became, taking on unintentional expressionistic qualities. He worked like crazy, filling sheet after sheet with pictures that got more and more disturbing. The windows in his drawings looked like eyes, and the way the house leaned made it look like it was moving even though it wasn't. He packed up his things and left without warning after a week, leaving behind several canvases that were not finished. Months later, when a friend asked about the project, the artist just shook his head and said that some places shouldn't be immortalized in art. He said that putting their essence on paper was bringing something bad into the world. The seasons kept going around and around. In the spring, wildflowers grew all around the property, but they never got too close to the house. In the summer, the mountains were full of life. But the area around the building was strangely quiet, as if animals and bugs had agreed to stay away. The trees near the house, on the other hand, lost their leaves weeks before the others. And in the winter, everything was covered in perfect snow that looked somehow grayer in that one spot. As the years went by, people who had lived in the area for a long time and had known Abigail personally, or at least seen her from time to time, began to die. They took away the nuances of the story, the little things that helped explain what was going on. Younger generations only knew versions of the stories that had been told many times, and these versions had added fantastical elements but lost their factual basis. It was pointless to talk about what was true and what was made up. A history professor from the area, who was interested in the story, tried to put together a complete timeline of events. He talked to all the survivors who had seen Abigail, looked at records about the Kincaid family, and looked into property transaction files and legal documents. What he found was incomplete and often at odds with itself. Different accounts had different dates, and the way events were described changed a lot depending on who was telling the story. There were also big gaps where there was no reliable information at all. He went to the property several times while doing his research, and each time he went, he became more convinced that there was something really strange about that place. He wasn't naturally superstitious. His education had taught him to look for real-world reasons for things that seemed strange. But it was hard to figure out what was wrong with the house. The sense of unease it caused was real, and could be measured by how it affected visitors, no matter what they believed or how they felt. His project ultimately culminated in a modest monograph, serving more as an exercise in documentation than a genuine effort to resolve the mystery. It came to the conclusion that Abigail Kincaid had acted in a very strange way in the months leading up to her disappearance, according to the standards of her time and community. The property showed signs of unusual activity, but the exact nature of that activity was still up for debate. The psychological effect of the place on visitors was too consistent to be dismissed as mere collective suggestion, but the reasons behind that effect were still unclear. The monograph was shared with a small number of academics who were interested but not shocked by what they read. It was just another piece of paper added to the collection of strange things that people have seen and done that aren't fully understood. The professor went on with his life, teaching local history to generations of students. He would sometimes use the case of Abigail Kincaid as an example of how stories about a community grow and change. The house, on the other hand, kept watch over the valleys below in silence. People casually mentioned it in navigation instructions, even though no one used it for anything useful. It had become a landmark for directions. It was just a part of the geography now, as permanent as the streams and rocks that made up that part of the Kentucky mountains. Its history was tied to the identity of the place, and it was impossible to separate them without changing how people thought about their own shared past. People who came by now and then noticed that the pictures they took of the property didn't often come out well. The cameras weren't broken, they just took strange pictures. Some were blurry, even though other pictures taken on the same day were perfectly clear, and some had areas of darkness that didn't match the actual lighting conditions. Some thought that the strange things that happened with the cameras at the time were to blame, while others thought that these flaws had a deeper meaning. In the mountains of Kentucky, time moves differently than it does in the rest of the world. Some places stay pretty much the same for decades, not because people are trying to keep them that way, but because there are no good reasons to change them. The Kincaid estate was one of those places that stayed the same, while other parts of the region slowly changed. As roads were paved and electricity reached the valleys, the house on the hilltop slowly fell apart, not caring about the changes that were happening. A strange thing started to happen in 1928. Lights appeared in the windows of the house on certain nights, faint, flickering glows visible for miles through the darkness of the mountains. They didn't look like the lights from regular candles or lanterns. They had a different, almost glowing quality and changed strength at random times. Hunters camping nearby reported these sightings, always accompanied by the same perplexing question: who or what was producing that illumination in a house that everyone knew was empty? Some theorized they were merely reflections of the moon on broken glass, or perhaps chemical reactions of decaying materials. Others pointed to natural phenomena, such as fireflies congregating in unusual patterns, or gases emanating from the ground that could create luminescence under specific conditions. But these explanations were not entirely satisfactory, especially when the lights appeared on moonless nights or when they moved from window to window, as if following some deliberate purpose. During one of these events, a group of young people decided to look into it. They were the children of local farmers, raised hearing stories about Abigail Kincaid, but belonging to a generation that questioned the superstitions of their elders. Equipped with flashlights and a youthful confidence that masked genuine nervousness, they climbed the mountain one night when the lights had been sighted. Their families disapproved of the expedition but could not completely dissuade them. They arrived at the property around midnight, their path illuminated only by the stars and their flickering lanterns. The house stood against the night sky, a black silhouette darker than the surrounding darkness. There were no visible lights from their initial position, which made them question whether the reports had been exaggerated. But as they approached, a pale glow began to emanate from one of the second-story windows, growing gradually as if fed by an invisible source. The young men exchanged glances, their initial bravado rapidly evaporating. The glow had a hypnotic quality, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost organic, like slow, deep breathing. One of them suggested they turn back, that they had seen enough to satisfy their curiosity. The others quickly agreed, none ashamed to admit the unease they felt. They descended the mountain faster than they had climbed it, occasionally glancing back to see if the light was still visible. It remained lit until they were too far away to distinguish it, then abruptly extinguished itself, like a candle blown by a sudden gust of wind. Their stories about that night circulated quickly, adding more layers to the mystery of the property. The older ones nodded with satisfaction, feeling vindicated in their warnings, while others of the same generation as the young people began to treat the place with reluctant respect. Perhaps there was something beyond exaggerated stories, something that deserved caution even in the modern age that was beginning to reach those remote mountains. The nature surrounding the house continued to behave in ways that defied normal patterns. Trees grew crooked, leaning away from the structure as if seeking to maximize distance. Roots that should naturally seek water seemed to avoid certain areas of the soil, creating circular patterns of vegetation that left empty spaces around specific points. Amateur geologists who examined the land found nothing obviously anomalous in the soil composition, but admitted that there was something strange about the way the plants reacted to the environment. A visiting botanist, intrigued by reports of these peculiar plant characteristics, spent weeks studying the local flora. He collected samples, analyzed growth patterns, and attempted to cultivate seeds from the area under controlled conditions. His results were inconclusive but disturbing. The plants appeared healthy on superficial analysis, but showed subtle cellular anomalies that he could not explain. When he tried cultivating the seeds far from the region, they germinated normally, as if the distance from the property freed them from some local influence. He wrote about his findings cautiously, suggesting that perhaps there were contaminants in the soil or microclimatic peculiarities affecting plant development. But in private conversations, he admitted genuine confusion, saying that in decades of botanical study he had never encountered similar patterns. Nature, in his experience, followed predictable laws. That patch of land in the Kentucky mountains seemed to operate according to slightly different rules. The 1930s brought economic hardship to many regions of the United States, and the Appalachian communities were no exception. People had to deal with real-life problems that made it hard to think about haunted houses and other mysteries. During this time, the Kincaid estate was mostly forgotten. It was mentioned from time to time, but it was no longer the main focus of attention. But forgetting didn't mean that the house was gone, or that it was less present in the landscape. It stayed there, slowly falling apart but not completely falling apart in ways that engineers found amazing. Wood that should have rotted completely still had some strength. Roofs that should have given way under decades of snow stayed partially intact. The house seemed to be in a delicate balance with the forces of nature, neither doing well nor completely failing. Someone would sometimes suggest tearing down the building, which would remove the eyesore from the landscape and let the land heal on its own. But these ideas never went beyond casual talk. Some of the resistance was practical. Tearing down such a remote building would have been too expensive and time-consuming to be worth it. But there was also a deeper hesitation, an unspoken fear that messing with the house might wake up things that were better left alone. A preacher who traveled to different mountain churches started telling the story of Abigail Kincaid in his sermons as a way to warn people about the dangers of going off the right path. In his retellings, Abigail became a symbol of someone who made bad choices, listened to bad people, and paid the price for being too stubborn. The message was clear: stay in the light, don't give in to temptations, and trust in your community and faith to lead you. These religious readings gave the story about the property another layer. It put the story in a moral context that was familiar to some people, which helped them understand it better. Some people thought it was too simple for something that was more complicated and unclear. No matter how you look at it, the effect was to keep the story alive so that new generations would grow up knowing at least one version of the story of Abigail Kincaid and the mysterious house that stood as a silent reminder of events that no one fully understood. Over the years, the Kentucky mountains changed slowly, but the Kincaid property stayed the same, tied to a moment that would never fully fade into the past. It was hard to picture those mountains without the house's dark presence dominating the highlands because it had become such a big part of the region's mythology. People told stories about Abigail as if they had happened hundreds of years ago, not just a few decades ago, giving them the timeless quality of really old legends. A very strong storm hit the area for several days in 1935. Strong winds knocked down trees, heavy rains caused landslides, and thunder echoed through the valleys like heavenly guns. Everyone thought that the Kincaid house would finally give in to this attack from nature, that years of damage would be done in one night of elemental rage. But when the storm was over and people went outside to see how bad the damage was, the house was still there. There were trees around it that had fallen, some of which were almost touching the walls, but the building was still mostly intact. Some windows had lost their frames, and part of the roof had flown off, but the main walls were still standing. It was as if the storm had chosen not to hit the building, or maybe it ran into something that stopped it. People were both amazed and scared by what they saw, which was more proof that this place had its own rules. A writer who was traveling through the area to gather stories for a book on Appalachian folklore was very interested in Abigail Kincaid's story. This writer was not interested in verifiable facts like the academic scholars of the past. Instead, they were interested in how communities create and keep their myths. He didn't care as much about the events being true as he did about what people thought they meant. He spent months in the area talking to people of all ages and getting different versions of the story. Everyone had a different point of view, and they all brought up different details that others didn't. Their interpretations were based on their own experiences and beliefs. An old farmer talked about how being alone can affect your mental health. A midwife from the area thought about family tragedies that might not have been revealed that could explain Abigail's behavior. A retired merchant remembered specific conversations that hinted at financial problems that weren't obvious. The author went to the property several times, but local guides always went with him and wouldn't let him go alone. They stood at a respectful distance while he looked at the building, taking notes and trying to put into words the mood that everyone talked about but few could really describe. He said he felt something, a presence that wasn't threatening but also wasn't welcoming, like being in a place where people were okay with him being there but didn't want him there. When his book finally came out, it had a whole chapter about Abigail Kincaid's story. He used the story as an example of how small groups deal with scary things by turning them into stories that serve social and mental health purposes. The house had come to stand for fears of being alone, the effects of breaking the rules, and mysteries that can't be explained in a logical way. In his analysis, it was more important as a story than as a collection of facts that could be checked. The book got some attention from people who were interested in folklore and cultural anthropology. It brought some outside attention to the area, and people who were curious about the famous house they had read about sometimes made pilgrimages to see it. People in the area had mixed feelings about the attention. They liked that people were interested in their history, but they didn't like that outsiders treated something they cared about deeply as just intellectual curiosity. As time went on, the house started to draw a certain kind of visitor, people who were interested in the paranormal, people who practiced alternative spiritual traditions, and people who wanted to have experiences that went beyond the ordinary. They brought different tools with them, like instruments that were said to be able to measure unseen energies, special cameras, and sensitive recorders. They spent the night on or near the property, either doing rituals or just watching and waiting for signs. These guests had different experiences. Some people left unhappy, saying they had only seen an old, falling-apart house. Some people said they had deep experiences, like feeling a presence, hearing voices speaking in languages they didn't know, or seeing figures that vanished when they looked at them directly. It was impossible to check these claims or tell which ones were real and which ones were made up by people who were expecting them to happen. However, the fact that some stories were so similar, especially the ones that said they felt heavy in the chest and had trouble breathing near the house, made it seem like something more than just psychological suggestion was going on. The people in the area had a practical view of these visitors. They didn't stop them or encourage them as long as they stayed off private property and didn't cause any trouble. They knew that Abigail Kincaid's story was now part of a bigger world, and that they no longer had any control over how it was used or understood. This made me feel uneasy, like something important and personal had been watered down by other people's attention. In 1940, there was a suggestion to turn the property into a museum or an official historical site of some kind. Supporters said that keeping the site would allow people to learn about the history of the area and could bring in some money through tourism. Opponents said that making money off of tragedy, even one that was mysterious and happened decades ago, was wrong. There were also practical questions about how to musicalize something when the basic facts were still so unclear and disputed. The proposal was eventually dropped, not by an official decision, but because it lost support. No one was dedicated enough to get the project past real-world problems and community opposition. The house went back to being mostly forgotten, with only occasional visits and no official or commercial stories about it. The seasons kept going around and around. Spring brought promises of new life, but they never fully came true on that property. In the summer, the heat there felt worse than in other places. Autumns made the mountains look sad and beautiful, and that old building made it even more so. And in the winter, snow covered everything. For some reason, it never looked completely white when it landed on that roof that was falling apart. It became harder and harder to find people who had lived in the area for a long time and had either known Abigail personally or seen her from a distance. Their deaths ended a direct link to the original events, turning verifiable history into a legend that was passed down through the generations. Younger generations only knew about filtered versions of the stories, which had become more fantastical but lost the details that direct witnesses could give. The house itself stayed the same, a silent witness keeping secrets that no one could tell directly anymore. The Kentucky mountains changed a lot over the next few decades, and these changes affected even the most remote valleys and communities. Roads got better, communication got better, and the outside world, which had once seemed far away, started to have more of an effect on traditional ways of life. But even as modernity spread to those old lands, the Kincaid estate stayed strange and separate from the normal flow of time and progress. The house was in such bad shape that it should have fallen down completely decades ago. Engineers who looked at the structure from time to time out of professional curiosity were confused by how long it had lasted. The main beams were badly damaged, the foundation had moved in a few places, and there were cracks in the outside walls that should have caused the building to fall apart. But the building still looked like itself, keeping its basic shape even as small parts of it slowly fell apart. It seemed like the house was trying to stop itself from going back to the ground completely, which made the decline happen slowly. People who lived nearby and had seen it over the years said that some parts seemed to fall apart faster than others, but the whole thing always stayed strong. Windows disappeared completely, leaving empty holes that looked like eye sockets, and looked out over the valleys. Parts of the roof eventually fell off, revealing beams to the sky. However, the walls, those walls covered in strange symbols and writing, stayed up. A group of veterans who had just come back from serving in the military decided to spend a few days camping in the mountains in 1948. They were looking for peace and quiet to deal with things that had deeply affected them. They picked a spot not too far from the Kincaid property, not because of any historical interest, but just because it was a good place to camp. People in the area tried to gently talk them out of it by suggesting other places, but the veterans saw these warnings as rural superstition that they had learned to ignore after years of living in the wider world. They set up camp in a clearing where they could see part of the house on the hill. On the first day, everything seemed fine. They fished in streams nearby, hiked along the trails, and talked around the campfire about what they wanted to do next now that they were back in civilian life. But when it got dark, the mood changed in a small way. The forest around me got too quiet. The lack of normal nighttime sounds made the air feel empty and creepy. One of them couldn't sleep, so they kept looking at the stars and the house every now and then. He swore he saw things moving in the dark windows, shadows moving from room to room, even though he knew no one lived there. At first, he thought they were just tricks of light and shadow or projections of his own tired mind. But the movements kept happening, always at the edge of his peripheral vision, and they went away when he tried to focus directly. He woke up his friends and pointed them in the direction of the house. They all stood there quietly and watched for a long time. Some people said they didn't see anything strange, just a broken building against the night sky. Others said they saw something, but they couldn't say what it was. In that direction, there was a sense of presence, as if something was watching them from a distance. One of them, who had seen a lot of fighting and had developed a strong sense of danger, told them to leave right away. They packed up their camp even though it was dark, using flashlights and working quickly because of their military training. None of them said they were scared out loud, but they all understood through body language that staying there would be a big mistake. That same night, they went down the mountain on trails that were only lit by their flashlights and the moonlight that peeked through the clouds every now and then. When they got back to civilization, they told their story, but only because they were ashamed that something so hard to explain had scared them away. Their stories made the stories about the property more believable. These men had been in real, life-threatening situations and weren't easily scared by shadows or old stories. Maybe the warnings that had been passed down through the generations were true if they felt they had to leave that place quickly. The people in the area nodded their heads in agreement, not judging them, but knowing that they had finally understood something that could only be felt. The 1950s saw a rise in interest in all kinds of strange events that couldn't be explained. There was a growing interest in stories that didn't make sense in popular magazines, on the radio, and in other forms of media. In this context, the story of Abigail Kincaid and her strange property found an audience, with articles about it appearing in publications that reached far beyond Kentucky's borders. This brought in a new group of visitors, some of whom were serious about their investigations and others who were just looking for excitement or ideas for their own stories. The people in the area came up with an unofficial way to deal with these curious people. They were polite when they answered questions, but they didn't encourage people to look into things. They gave basic directions, but also made it clear that they would not tolerate disrespect for the property or the memories of those who were involved in the original events, no matter how obscure they were. In 1952, an independent documentary filmmaker came to the area with cameras and a goal to film the Kincaid property and its atmosphere. He had worked on projects about other places that people thought were haunted, and he did so with professional skepticism but an open mind. He spent weeks filming the house from different angles, at different times of day, and in different kinds of weather. He talked to people who lived there, gathered stories, and tried to put together a clear story from the bits and pieces he had. The outcome was strange. The movie had a lot of strange technical problems, especially in shots of the house. There were dark streaks where there shouldn't have been, the focus didn't work for no reason, and audio recordings that should have been clean were ruined by strange sounds. He worked hard to figure out what was wrong with his equipment, but it worked perfectly when he used it in other places. It was as if the property didn't want to be documented at all, and it fought back against attempts to capture its essence on film. The documentary was never finished to everyone's satisfaction. Some pieces of the film are still in obscure archives, where film buffs sometimes find them, but the director was never able to put them together into something that could be widely distributed. He later said in interviews that the project was his biggest professional failure, not because he didn't try hard enough, but because the subject just wouldn't cooperate with normal documentation. In the meantime, the house went on living without any problems. Every winter, people hoped it would be the last one, that the snow and ice would finally do what decades of bad weather had failed to do. Every spring, it became clear that the structure was still there, though it had gotten smaller. It was almost defiant in its refusal to go away completely, as if Abigail Kincaid had left behind not only a building, but also a sense of stubbornness that ran through the wood and stone. Kids in the area grew up hearing stories about the property. These stories were changed so that they were less scary, but still mysterious. They thought of it as a part of the local imaginary geography as much as a real physical feature. There were games where kids tried to get as close to the house as possible, and there were daring games that parents didn't like, but that kids kept playing year after year. Not many people actually got very close. Their natural fear usually beat out their childish bravado before they got too close to danger. A psychologist who was visiting and wanted to study how physical environments affect mental states asked if they could do experiments on the property. He wanted to see if there were any measurable parts of the discomfort that people reported all the time by measuring their physiological responses as they got closer to the house. Local authorities, to the extent that they existed for abandoned property, denied permission, not out of scientific objection, but out of practical concern about liability if something happened to research participants. He conducted limited studies nonetheless, working with volunteers who agreed to approach the property while connected to portable monitoring equipment. The results were interesting, but not clear. As they got closer to the house, many of the participants' heart rates and blood pressures went up. These changes couldn't be fully explained by the physical effort of climbing the hill. Some people said they felt dizzy or sick, but these feelings went away when they moved away. However, it was still hard to find a specific reason for these reactions. The psychologist published his results in a little-known academic journal. He said that some places might have psychic imprints that affect visitors in small but measurable ways. His theories were met with skepticism by colleagues, considered too speculative for serious science, but he maintained that there was a real phenomenon that deserved further investigation, even if the mechanisms remained mysterious. The years passed like leaves carried by the Appalachian wind, each season leaving its subtle mark on the landscape, but never completely erasing what had been. The Kincaid estate was a silent witness to something that went beyond simple understanding. It was a place where the line between what could be explained and what was mysterious seemed to be thinner than in other parts of the world. The house continued its slow dissolution, the wood gradually returning to the earth, but maintaining an undeniable presence even in its advanced ruin. Travelers crossing those mountains still deviated from their paths when possible, still feeling that tightness in their chest upon seeing the decaying structure atop the hill. It wasn't fear of anything in particular. It was just a gut feeling that some places have a weight that words can't fully describe. Over the years, the stories about Abigail Kincaid have changed, adding new meanings that show how each generation felt and thought about them. For some, it was a story about being alone and how it affects your mind. For some, it was a symbol of things that don't have easy answers, reminding us that not everything can be explained by logic and reason. And for a lot of people, it was just a story that was part of the mountain's identity, as important as the pine trees and the cold streams. What really went on at that property in the last few months before Abigail went missing? What natural or other forces turned a single woman and a normal house into a story that would live on for generations? These questions stayed unanswered, lost in the fog that comes down from the heights like whispers of secrets that no one wants to tell. People who live in the area now have a complicated relationship with its past. People are proud to have such a long and interesting story, but they are also uncomfortable with the attention it sometimes gets. Some tourists still go on pilgrimages, looking for something beyond the ordinary and to feel that sense of presence that so many have talked about over the years. The community puts up with them with patience, which they learned from years of curious visitors. They offer basic hospitality but stay away from speculation about deeper meanings. The property has become almost abstract because it is still there. It is no longer just a building. It is now a symbol, a marker in the landscape that stands for everything about human experience that is still not understood. The walls that are still standing are covered in vines and moss and have symbols that no one has ever fully understood. The empty rooms are full of silences that feel deeper than just not having any sound. On winter nights, when the wind blows through the valleys, it sometimes brings something more than just the smell of pine and frozen ground. People who pay attention can hear echoes of old stories and whispers of events that have left their mark on those lands in ways that time has not been able to completely erase. They aren't real voices. They're feelings and impressions that make your skin crawl and your heart race for no clear reason. The Kincaid home is an unintentional monument to the mysteries that make life so interesting. It is in the mountains of Kentucky. It stands for all the questions we ask without expecting answers, and all the times we feel something beyond what we can see in reality. It is a reminder that there are still dark corners of the world where things don't make sense and certainty disappears. We tell these stories not because we know the answers, but because we know how important the questions are. They link us to people who lived before us and saw the same things and felt the same shivers of recognition when they faced the unknown. And maybe we'll find something useful in that link, even if the main mystery stays unsolved. The mountains are jealous of their secrets, as they always are. As long as there's enough wood to keep the Kincaid estate looking like it does now, it will stay that way. Even after that, people who live there will remember it. No matter where Abigail Kincaid went on that last winter night so many years ago, she left behind something that is more than just her body. And maybe that's what makes stories like this so strong. They remind us how weak we are when we don't fully understand what's going on, and how much we need to find meaning even when the facts are hard to find. The house is still there, slowly falling apart, but not completely forgotten. Abigail Kincaid's story is still being told, with each telling adding small changes but keeping the mystery at its core. If you liked this trip through the dark parts of the Kentucky mountains, you might want to subscribe to the channel. There are many more creepy stories waiting to be told, and there are mysteries hiding in forgotten places that need to be found. Please leave a comment with your thoughts on the mystery of Abigail Kincaid, and don't forget to like this story if it moved you. The mountains stand still, keeping secrets that may never be fully revealed. Somewhere in those misty heights, a house keeps watch, an eternal witness to events that are too strange to understand and should stay that way.